The night everything changed was quiet enough to feel harmless. The kind of silence that makes you believe nothing bad could possibly happen. Neighbors later said they heard no screams, no struggle, no sudden noise that would haunt them afterward. Just an ordinary evening in a respectable neighborhood where people believed they knew each other. Inside the house, a man who had built his image on trust, responsibility and family values was making a decision that would transform him from a grieving husband into a wealthy suspect with a carefully rehearsed story. To the outside world, his life looked stable. A devoted husband, a hard-working professional, and someone who spoke often about responsibility and sacrifice. His wife was described as kind, reserved and deeply committed to her family. Friends believed they were an ordinary couple dealing with ordinary stresses. Financial pressure existed, yes, but nothing that seemed dangerous. At least not at first glance. What no one realized was how quietly resentment had been growing behind closed doors, fueled by debt, ambition and the belief that freedom was being suffocated by obligation. Money was always part of the tension. Bills piled up, investments failed, and expectations rose faster than income. The man had grown obsessed with a future that felt permanently out of reach. He wanted success, admiration and comfort, but every calculation reminded him of limitations. To him, his wife was no longer a partner, but a reminder of responsibilities he wanted to escape. Conversations turned cold, affection faded, arguments became frequent, then strangely controlled. He learned to hide anger behind calm expressions, practicing patience that was not genuine but strategic. The idea didn't come suddenly. It formed slowly, dangerously, over time. First, as frustration, then as fantasy, and eventually as a solution. He researched quietly, learning how people disappear, how investigations unfold, and how sympathy can be manipulated. He understood one crucial truth. Society is quick to comfort a grieving spouse. He believed that if he played the role convincingly, no one would question his tears. On the night of the crime, nothing appeared unusual. The couple shared a routine evening. Later, only one of them would walk out of the room alive. What happened inside was never witnessed, only reconstructed through evidence and contradictions. Authorities would later believe the act was swift, calculated, and disturbingly controlled. There was no chaotic rage, no loss of control. This was a man executing a plan he had rehearsed mentally many times before. Once it was over, the next challenge was concealment. Panic was replaced with focus. He wrapped the body carefully, not as an act of care, but efficiency. He had already chosen the location days earlier, a remote piece of land where he knew time and isolation would work in his favor. Under the cover of darkness, he buried the truth along with his wife, believing that soil could erase responsibility. The following morning, he transformed himself into a victim. He reported her missing with visible distress. His voice cracked at the right moments. His hands trembled just enough. He spoke of love, concern, and fear. Friends and relatives rallied around him, offering support and sympathy. Search efforts were organized. Photos were shared. Candlelight gatherings were held. And through it all, he stood at the center, grieving publicly, while privately calculating his next steps. As days passed, the narrative worked in his favor. Media attention portrayed him as a worried husband. Interviews showed a man desperate for answers. Donations poured in. Assistance funds were created. What no one knew was that financial relief had already begun to arrive through other means. Insurance policies previously ignored by others suddenly became valuable assets. Paperwork moved quickly. Claims were filed. Payouts followed. With money came change. He upgraded his lifestyle. New purchases appeared sooner than expected. Trips were taken. Debt disappeared. To some, it looked like recovery. To others, it felt unsettling. People noticed how quickly grief seemed to fade, how sorrow was replaced with confidence, how mourning clothes were replaced with tailored suits. Rumors began to circulate quietly, though no one dared to accuse him openly. Investigators, however, are trained to listen to silence as much as words. Small inconsistencies appeared in his statements, timelines shifted, details changed. His description of events didn't always align with digital records. Phone data showed movement that contradicted his version. Financial activity raised eyebrows. And then there was the land. The place he insisted he had no reason to visit suddenly became important. When authorities finally searched the area, they didn't expect answers so quickly. Disturbed soil revealed what grief had hidden. The truth emerged from the ground, undeniable and irreversible. The wife was found where he had buried her, ending the performance he had maintained for weeks. The man who had convinced everyone of his innocence now stood exposed, not as a victim, but as the architect of his own downfall. Arrested and questioned, his confidence collapsed. The calm facade cracked under pressure. Evidence stacked higher than excuses. Financial motives became clear. The story of love dissolved into a narrative of greed. What shocked the public most was not just the crime, but the patience behind it. The realization that someone could smile, cry, and accept condolences while carrying such a secret. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the image of a grieving husband had completely vanished. In its place stood a man whose desire for wealth had outweighed human life. A family destroyed not by chaos, but by calculation, and a lesson that still echoes long after the verdict. Sometimes the most dangerous intentions hide behind the calmest expressions. Once the truth was uncovered, the public reaction shifted from sympathy to disbelief. People who had stood beside him during searches now replayed every memory, every sentence, every tear, wondering how they had missed the warning signs. Friends recalled moments that once seemed harmless, but now felt calculated. His calm demeanor, once admired, appeared rehearsed. His grief, once convincing, now felt like a performance refined through careful observation. Others, during interrogation, he maintained composure longer than most. He denied responsibility, blaming misunderstanding and coincidence. But investigators had already connected the pieces. Digital footprints painted a clearer picture than his words ever could. Location data placed him exactly where he claimed he had never been. Financial records showed preparation, not desperation. Internet searches revealed curiosity that crossed into intent long before his wife disappeared. Experts later explained that this was not a crime of impulse. It was the result of long-term justification. He had slowly convinced himself that his life was being held back, that freedom required sacrifice, and that consequences could be managed. This mindset allowed him to detach emotionally, reducing a human life into an obstacle. That detachment is what made him so convincing afterward. He wasn't overwhelmed by guilt, because he believed the outcome benefited him. In court, the prosecution focused on motive rather than emotion. They showed how wealth followed death almost immediately. Insurance policies were activated with unsettling speed. Assets were liquidated, new accounts were opened, the lifestyle upgrades that once seemed like recovery now appeared as rewards. Each transaction became a silent witness, testifying against him without speaking a word. The defense attempted to argue circumstantial doubt. They suggested stress, confusion, and misinterpretation. But jurors are rarely persuaded when patterns repeat too clearly. Every explanation required another coincidence. Every denial conflicted with another fact. The narrative collapsed under its own weight. By the time closing arguments ended, the outcome felt inevitable. When the verdict was read, the room was silent. No dramatic reaction, no sudden outburst. Just the stillness of someone realizing that control had finally slipped away. The man who believed he could manipulate perception now faced a reality he could not rewrite. His wealth, his plans, his carefully constructed future, all of it became meaningless in that moment. Sentencing followed, and with it came the final transformation. No longer a respected husband, no longer a grieving figure. He became a cautionary example, a reminder that greed does not always appear loud or reckless. Sometimes it wears patience. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it waits. The family left behind faced a different kind of sentence. They were forced to grieve twice, once for the loss and once for the betrayal. Trust had been shattered along with their sense of safety. They questioned their judgment, wondering how someone so close could carry such darkness unnoticed. Healing, they learned, would take far longer than any trial. Psychologists later analyzed the case, pointing out a critical detail. He didn't act because he lacked emotion. He acted because he controlled it. His ability to separate feeling from action allowed him to plan, wait, and execute without hesitation. This is what made the case so disturbing. Not rage, not chaos, but discipline used for destruction. Years later, the story continues to be discussed not because of how violent it was, but because of how quiet it appeared. No warning signs obvious enough, no dramatic collapse beforehand, just a gradual shift from partnership to possession, from responsibility to resentment. It serves as a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. People still ask how someone could commit such a crime and walk freely among others afterward. The answer lies in perception. Society often trusts appearances. We believe calm equals honesty and grief equals innocence. This case shattered those assumptions. It proved that manipulation doesn't require aggression, only patience and confidence. The land where the truth was buried eventually returned to silence. Grass grew back, footprints faded. But the story remains, passed from documentary to discussion, from investigation to warning, not as entertainment but as evidence of how ambition, when unchecked by empathy, can erase boundaries that should never be crossed. In the end, he didn't just bury his wife, he buried his identity, his future, and any claim to the life he believed he deserved. The wealth he gained became irrelevant compared to what he lost. Freedom, trust, humanity. And that is the real horror of this case. Not just that someone died, but that someone believed the price was worth paying.